Iconography and fame in the Italian Renaissance, the Diego Ortiz case. We've got three papers this afternoon. The first is going to be given by Manuel Lafarga Marquez, who is with us here. The second paper is by Teresa Chàfer Bixker, but Manuel is going to read her paper for her because she can't be with us. And then the third paper will be given by Penelope Sanz Gonzalez. So the first, and what we'll do is we will read all three papers consecutively, and then we'll have a conversation at the end. So our first paper is given by Manuel Lafarga Marquez, who has a PhD in History and Aesthetics of Music. He's professor at the Valencia Conservatory of Music Joaquin Rodrigo, and for 20 years has been music history professor at the University of Valencia. Since 2016, he has led a research group on the musical iconography of the Spanish-Italian Renaissance and its cultural and social implications. His paper this afternoon is called Renaissance Musical Careers, Italian Spaniards in the mid-1500s. Manuel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First time, many thanks to the organizing committee of the 7th Sibelius Academy Symposium on Music History, and equally to the audience for paying attention to our work. The possibility to introduce the most renowned European viola gambist during the Cinquecento to an expert audience, and especially inside the Finnish academic circles, is a true pleasure for us. Before to begin, our colleague and partner Teresa Chàfer, the second opponent, could not come to Finland, but I will read her presentation. We think that it's better to leave the question time for the ends, because the three papers that are related, integrated in the same, in the same general title, and each one of them has its own title. And these are some printings for the audience where you may appreciate all topics related this great canvas, The Wedding at Cana by Paolo Veronese. Penelope, please. This is our own internet address, and I begin with my own presentation. Renaissance Musical Careers, Italian Spaniards in the Middle Cinquecento. Excuse me. It was our colleague Javier Alejandro Casillas who first identified Diego Ortiz 10 years before our meeting in 2017. Next to the Malaga Cathedral, he informed us about the probable identity of the unknown musician who whispered his diminutions in the left ear of Veronese. He also informed us his own unsuccessful attempts till that moment, from the 10 years earlier, to convince any art specialist who properly considered his proposal. An enterprise that we undertook and completed, in our opinion, successfully, and that has generated by now more than a dozen works devoted to these topics, 10 of them already published, one in press. You may free download at our webpage. Later, I remember you. The engraving is also the only known portrait of one of the most important and famous European viola gambists at the moment of publication of the treatise 10 years before the termination of the wedding, alike of the conclusion of the canvas. His facial features are quite unusual, though individually or in some combination they could be present in many other characters. It is unlikely they all appear together at time in two different famous viola gambists separated by 10 years. It is also unlikely that other specialized coeval musicians could coincide in so many traits. We think that the general shape and aspect of the face and hair of both portraits show a surprising similarity, which is supported by 12 specific features. 1. Shape of the high style. 2. High type, short and curly. 3. Shape and density of the bird. 4. Shape of the receding hairline of the forehead. 5. Form of the hairline plus one wrinkle at the temple. 6. 3 longitudinal wrinkles in the forehead. 7. 3 wrinkles in the corner of the eye. 8. Prolonged pocket below the eye. 9. General shape, contour and size of the nose. 10. Shape of the ala and alar furrow of the nose. 11. Shape of the ear and its relative size. And 12. Proportions of facial traits and general overall appearance. Despite the efforts of renowned scholars, so little was known about Diego Ortiz until very recently that it could be summarized in a couple of paragraphs. Born on an uncertain date, perhaps in Toledo, since the demonym Toledano was synonymous in Italian lands with Spanish, because this was the imperial capital. We have news of him for the first time in Rome due to the publication of his first book in December 1553, the Treatise of Glosses, this illustration. The book is dedicated to Pedro de Urries, but in the probable case of having arrived earlier in Neapolitan lands, he would have first served Pedro de Toledo, viceroy from 1532 to 1552, and died in Florence the following year, 10 months before the edition of the treatise. His name appears a few years later in a 1558 payroll of the Neapolitan court of the House of Alba, and 7 years later, in 1565, Musice's Liber Primus, his second known work, was published in Venice. His death was supposed to have occurred in 1570 because his succession as Maestro de Capilla of the Royal Chapel of Naples by Francisco Jiménez de Loscos. A recent work, however, Valerio Morucci, 2018, from University of Reno in Nevada, places him in Rome for 6 years after his presumed death in 1570, until at least 1576. The term viola da gamba is mentioned in the Cinquecento for the first time in 2 readings from 1511, the German treatise by Sebastian Verdun and the Ippolito d'Este Catalogue of Instruments. The first treatise dedicated to the solo practice was that of Silvestro Ganassi dal Fontego, published in Venice in 1542, which was followed by that of Ortiz in Rome 11 years later. These are the only 2 treatises dedicated to the instrument during the 16th century. Ganassi insisted on the opposite opinion to Diego, preventing to hold the viola horizontally in the Moorish manner, as these instruments are depicted in Veronesi's wedding at Cana. The book was published in 2 versions, Spanish and Italian, by the brothers Valerio and Luis Dorico, the editors for the Vatican. It seems that Ortiz was also a clergyman, as clarified in the papal privilege of his own treatise, and alike that he had arrived as a man of arms in the company of other Spanish musicians to the surroundings of the Neapolitan court of Pedro de Toledo. The Viceroy of Naples, since 1532, died on February 12, 1553, while Ortiz's first book was published in Rome 10 months later, on December 10, dedicated to Pedro de Urries. Some sources suggest that Ortiz became known as a viola instructor in the environment of this nobleman of Aragonese origin. The Spanish musician signed the dedication of his treatise in Naples to Pedro de Urries, a renowned protector of the arts, judging by the author's own words. The figure of this Aragonese nobleman has so far received little attention, also in relation to the life of Ortiz, due to the extreme scarcity of data, added to the presumption that he had died in Sicily in combat in 1519. Already in 1727, one of his descendants, Ruiz de Castilla y Urríez, had questioned his early death by providing a notarial document from 1555. 2 years earlier, according to Paris records, his son Hugo had been named Lord of Ayerbe in case he could be died in the service of the emperor in the war against France, sick. The document proves that he was alive in 1553. Pedro de Urríez obtained the barony of Pirano 2 years later, in 1555, and requested permission from the authorities to exploit the mines he owned in Sicily. Finally, he was still alive in 1559, but outside Aragon, as deduced from a document from his wife. While 2 years later, in 1561, he must have died, given that the new heir to the barony was already his son. It is possible that Diego Ortiz came from, or at least participated in, the violas orchestra of the court of Ferrante de Aragon, Viceroy of Valencia, one of the most renowned ensembles along the mid-Cinquecento. At its peak, coinciding with the death of the Viceroy in 1550, the musical chapel consisted of 42 singers, 21 instrumentalists, 3 organists, 2 copists, and 1 dance teacher. The orchestra was left in charge of his second wife, Mencía de Mendoza, although without funds, and its musicians finally dispersed around 1553, the same year in which Ortiz published in December his treatise in Rome. The oldest preserved viola da gamba was depicted in the Cathedral of Valencia on 1472 by Francesco Pagano and Paolo de San Leocadio, 2 painters who came from Rome in the service of the bishop of the diocese, Rodrigo de Borgia, future Pope Alexander VI. The instrument clearly shows the frets and 5 strings. This is the most ancient depicted viola, till our days. We may appreciate the magnificent Renaissance cupola of the Cathedral of Valencia with 12 musician angels. It is admitted that the viola da gamba has its origin in the Spanish bowed vihuela, and that it is spread throughout Europe from the Aragonese, Catalan, or Valencian courts. The angel is this. Excuse me. This is the viola, and this is the vihuela, the bowed vihuela, and this is the hand vihuela. However, in this cupola, both instruments had slightly different shape, different control, but they are the same instrument. The identity of the Spanish musician has remained hidden until our first work in 2018, even without allusion in literary sources, where it has been repeatedly omitted. His portrait at the canvas had confused the scholars for 250 years, since Zanetti the Younger wrongly attributed his identity to Tintoretto, in turn omitting the mention of its true owner, the violinist. We believe to have shown, however, that the original proposal of his relative Zanetti the Elder, who attributed it to the violinist, was the correct. Therefore, it necessarily came from a legend based on the real context of the canvas during its creation. His facial features, compared to his self-portrait at the age of 54, still exhibited today in the Sala Grande of the Scuola di San Rocco, seem much more coherent with the character depicted on the canvas. Excuse me. Ortiz's second book, Musicus Liber Primus, is dedicated to Don Pedro Afán de Rivera, who was officially designated Viceroy and successor of Pedro de Toledo after more than 6 years and 7 prelates and generals as interim viceroys. The book contains sacred polyphony in a compendium of 69 vocal pieces in 4, 5, 6, and 7 voices, and was published in Venice in 1565 by the printer Antonio Gardano, just over a year after the delivery of the Veronese canvas. In the dedication, the author identifies himself still in Naples and expresses his desire to write a book of masses, a work of which there is no information and which probably did not reach the printing. The title suggests that he planned a second part for this work, perhaps the Book of Masses. It's very likely that after his arrival to the Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore at the end of the summer of 1563, Ortiz met in Venice with Josefo Zarlino to the right and Galileo's father, Vincenzo, to the left, who was an excellent lute player as well as theorist of the Camerata Bardi. Vincenzo settled in Venice the same year that Veronese's canvas was completed and began studying with Zarlino, who held the position of chapel master of San Marco opposite the island of Benedictines. Firstly, we proposed, based on Alejano's observation, that the initial figuration of this score could also be reproducing the anonymous tenor of La Spagna, one of those used by the Neapolitan master in his own treatise. The first of the two initial figures, which seem the same, could be indicating the F key on the fourth line. The second one, the scope or tessiture of the instrument. The third and fourth, a flat on the note B, F-dur tonality, and the measure time, respectively. While the first notes depicted on the pentagram seem to coincide with the allotted theme of the treatise, except for the third one, located one tone below, which could be indicating a coincidence close to 70% between both designs, the tenor and our proposal. Secondly, we also propose that the literary inscription observed in the score under Titian's hand is only coherent given the orientation of the spellings for the Veronese's gaze, and that it could be indicating both the origin of the new egregious guest as the name of one of the themes he chose to compose his famous treatise, La Spagna, the same one we are postulating for the score that Ortiz should look at. We believe that the inscription is here, and you may appreciate here, reoriented. We believe that the inscription could be literally interpreted as Spania, as can still be currently appreciated on the canvas. We are showing the X-ray image published by Louvre Museum in 1992 in a brilliant chapter by Lola Faillan-Dumas, which allowed us to unravel the previous ensemble designs in a coherent order. There were 4 consecutive consorts till the current one with Violas da Gamba and Diego Ortiz. Nevertheless, the protagonist for the 4 previous musical formation was the Venetian painter Giorgio da Castelfranco. We have showed the original consort at Baltimore on November 2023, 16th Century Studies Conference with Jennifer Mara da Silva and Luba Friedman as panel conductors. We introduced there 2 papers by our team. One for the original funeral mass by myself, a funeral sung mass for Giorgione at San Giorgio Maggiore as his pending Venetian citizen right, because he died 50 years earlier to the canvas in the Lazzaretto because the plague. And he was buried in an anonymous tomb. And this was the posthumous homage of the Veronese. And the second one, for the three next formations, musical formations, till the ultimate consort with Ortiz by Penélope Sanz and Jorge Camarero, Giorgio da Castelfranco in Veronese's Wedding at Cana, technical analysis and artistic recreation of five-chained consort. First consort was the pending funeral mass for Giorgio da Castelfranco, who died at Lazzaretto 50 years earlier because of the plague. Giorgione could not receive his Venetian citizen right, being buried in an anonymous grave. To the right, or free publication for this original ensemble is one of these are circulating, where the whole explanation of its arrangement is detailed. This formation is the typical Venetian mass for the deaths. Two cantatori di morti, or in some cases for a vocal consort, more professional, singing polyphony and not monophony, accompanied by a harpsichord, or in other cases by lutes, from 1.5 century earlier to the canvas. Second, this is a transition, it's the same thing. We may appreciate up the silhouette of Ortiz on top of the X-ray image of Giorgione. And this is the first consort. Our findings were also introduced to the North American academic circles through the University of Maryland College Park in the context of GAHA lectures, Diego Ortiz and Giorgione at the Wedding at Cana, The Forgotten History of a Famous Canvas, organized by the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the Michelle Smith Collaboratory for Visual Culture. Second consort had been introduced previously at Lucas International Conference on Music Patronage in Italy from the 5th to the 8th century, organized by Luigi Boccherini Foundation on November 2019, and attended in our case by the prestigious Cambridge Music History editor Ian Fenlon. To the right are free two publications for this topic. Oh my God. All presentations we are mentioning are available through our YouTube channel, Manuel Lafarga. We may appreciate here the emergence of Veronese with her first lute, Giorgio de Castelfranco with his legendary lute, Tintoretto, and Titian, Giorgione's friend from their youth. All the previous ensembles had Giorgione as its main protagonists, till the ultimate one motivated by the later arrival of Diego Ortiz to San Giorgio Maggiore. This is the world consort. Third consort was the first version of a new violin band, which actualized the musical fashion for this time at the Venetian confraternities, with Giorgione playing his first violin. We may appreciate both consecutive ensembles based on our own designs over the X-ray image. This is the first one. In fact, this violin is still visible in the canvas. If you, well, part of this violin. If you remember me later, I can show you. Fourth concert, the second violin band. Well, this is the silhouettes of the third concert, first violin band. Berenice is one position retired. And this is the fourth consort. Fourth consort was the second version for this modern instrumental ensemble and included the emergence of two brass instruments, one for a trombonist monk, later disappeared. Here is a trombonist monk, and a U-shaped trumpet beside the right side of the author of Canvas, Paolo Cagliari. This is the ensemble which Ortiz saw to his later arrival to San Giorgio Maggiore at the end of summer of 1563. This ensemble was introduced to the international academic community. Excuse me, this is the wall silhouettes. This ensemble was introduced to the international academic community in Castellón de la Plana on April 2023 at the Salvador Seguí Hager Conservatory, coinciding with the presentation of a reconstruction of this early trumpet by our team, in this case beside Luis Escribano, the luthier, up, and Vicente Campos, a brilliant trumpetist and the conductor of the institution, down. And I think this is all by my part in the first of our panel presentations. Next, I'm going to read that of our partner and colleague, Teresa Chàfer. She could not come, she could not connect. Okay, this is the general title of the panel. Excuse me, and this is our, in the first, the wedding at Kenya.org, you may free download many of our publications. And this is the title of Teresa Chàfer publication. And for me, it's a pleasure to speak in her name. The Famigliari is an investment, cultural and economic prestige in the Colonna family of the Italian Renaissance. The date and place of birth of Diego Ortiz are not known, because in Italian lands, the demonym Toledano was synonymous with Spanish, given that the imperial capital was Toledo. Based on similar examples, it has been suggested that this could have been the meaning for the second surname, such as the almost parallel of Juan Bautista de Toledo, who arrived in Naples 1 year after the death of Pedro de Toledo as a royal architect of the viceroyalty. He worked with Michelangelo in the Vatican and later in Florence, holding the position of Master Chief of Works at the monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial, where the emperor was buried, from 1562 until his death in 1567, when was relieved in the conduction of the work by Juan de Herrera. It seems symptomatic that the renowned architect, Juan Bautista de Toledo, used the demonym to identify himself just during his time in Naples, but not when his name appears in Rome and Florence, nor in El Escorial. Cerones later mentioned in 1613 of the Spanish musician, Diego Ortiz, does not refer to the demonym either. Diego Ortiz was one of the best composers of his time, and he worked as much as possible to imitate Morales. Some musical dictionaries stated that Ortiz's name appeared as a composer of motets in a Spanish publication from 1547, Silva de Sirenas by Enriquez de Valderrábano, but this information was denied by Borrowdale. The name which appears in two of these motets is Miguel Ortiz. Just as his own proposal has been questioned, Borrowdale supposedly placed him in Toledo in 1552 as a canon until a few weeks before the publication of his first book in Rome, related to the position of organist to which Morales aspired at this time. According to Robert Stevenson, the canon who signed the document and the Spanish viola gambists are not the same individual. Cristobal de Morales had held his ecclesiastical positions chapel master in Avila and Plasencia between 1526 and 1532, while traces of him were lost in the following years until 1535. On May 8, 1534, Pope Clement VII granted him the benefit of the parish church of San Martin de Salamanca, but it is likely that the position did not require his presence, as would be the norm after the Council of Trent from 1563. Morales was cantor of the Papal Chapel for 10 years, from 1535 until his definitive return to Spain in 1545. However, several notes after his arrival to Rome give rise to the assumption that he may have visited the Neapolitan court of Pedro de Toledo in the years prior to his Roman states. Sec. Morales advenit de Napoli. He had arrived to Papal Chapel on September 1st. In this way, it is improbable that he left Rome 1 month later, in October, having occupied his position barely 7 weeks earlier, except in the case that he lived in fact in Naples during the previous years. In May 1545, he obtained a 10-month permit to visit his country, but he did not return to Italy, taking up the position of chapel master in the Cathedral of Toledo, the imperial capital, at the offer of the cathedral authorities without competition, dated September 1 of this same year. Morales was an important character in the papal court with European renown. In 1536, he may have presented his music before the highest authorities of the time on the occasion of the entry into the city of Charles V, in a series of events convened by Pope Paul V, Alejandro Farnesio. In this occasion, the emperor gave 100 ducats to the singers of Papal Chapel. Although it is not proven that he presented them before the emperor, in the next meeting between both leaders and Francis I of France, 2 years later, he was the official composer elected for the event which commemorates the Peace of Nice, illustrated here. Jubilate Deo Omnis was the motet chosen by Morales, who went to the celebration with his own musical chapel, in addition to those of both monarchs. Morales also visited Naples during the decade in which he was a singer in the papal courts of Rome. In October 1535, as previously mentioned, and perhaps also from 20 to 28 in January 1540. He had famous unconditional friends. Juan Bermudo dedicates a long list of epithets to him praising his art, epithets that Martín de Tapia, in his work Vergel de Música, and Diego Ortiz himself repeat almost point by point. Later, Pietro Cerone alludes in 1613 to a Sec, Mr. Graduate in Rome, who would have taught him about Ortiz's desire to follow in Morales' footsteps on the path of musical excellence. Johannes Tinctoris, the author of the famous 8 Rules of Composition, which summarize the syntactical rules of our tonal music system to our days, was the most renowned viola da gamba virtuoso in precedent century, around 1470, in the same city and with the same position, which will be held by Diego Ortiz at Naples in the middle of Cinquecento. Political and cultural heritage of the Aragonese monarchy during the second half of Quattrocento had brought the Royal Chapel of Naples to very high levels of quality, and the city itself to the cultural and artistic vanguard of Europe. Naples was the most populated city of the Spanish Empire, only surpassed in Europe by Paris. The capella of the city was one of the largest and most prestigious music institutions, counting around 40 renowned singers and performers of several nationalities. Unfortunately, there is a historical gap in its archives from 1495, the end of the Aragonese era, to the end of the 16th century, and the first known documents on music at the viceregal court date from 1648. However, we know that the Royal Chapel was moved from Castelnuovo to the new adjacent viceregal headquarters by Pedro de Toledo in 1540, and that it was refounded again in 1555 in the time of Viceroy Pedro Pacheco. Diego conducted this new formation at least from then until 1570, and probably also the previous one, since he was already chapel master in December 1553, when the treatise was published. In 2003, the names of two active musicians in the Ortiz chapel were reported. One, a soprano singer named Michele Garcia, and the other one, an organist named Fabrizio Gaetato or Gaetano di Sesa, who had apparently arrived just as Ortiz as a man of arms at the time of the original nucleus of the musical chapel of the Royal Palace. The blind Spanish organist Francisco de Salinas maintained close contact with Ortiz for years. He had previously been in Rome since 1538, also coinciding there with Cristobal de Morales, and later joined the Neapolitan musical chapel of Ortiz as organist until 1558, shortly before returning to Spain. Salinas must have been in Naples before 1553, as we have also suggested for Ortiz, given that, as Diego's future successor, Francisco Jiménez de los Cos, informs us, they were both singers in the musical chapel of Pedro de Toledo. The next news about Ortiz places him again in the Royal Chapel of Naples, 5 years after the edition of the treatise. His name appears in the collection of letters and documents gathered in 1891 by the Duchess of Alba, where he is mentioned again with the position of chapel master, heading a list of musicians' salaries in February 1558. Diego signed his own salary and also in his name that of Francisco de Salinas, organist, and those of 12 musicians, mainly singers, while that of the organist Fabrizio Gaetato, presumably in the royal chapels since 1555 with Ortiz, does not appear. Jiménez de los Cos, who would later be his successor in 1570, appears in 4th place. Even today, some sources cite this date for his admission to the Neapolitan court as chapel master, and also that of 1556, attributing this circumstance to the Viceroy Fernando Álvarez of Toledo. Both mistakes were already pointed out by Robert Stevenson many years ago, since the acting Viceroy at this time was his son, Fadrique Álvarez de Toledo. Robert James Borrowdale correctly mentions the year 1558 and reproduced the original document verbatim in his doctoral thesis of 1952. Musica et Figura the musicological magazine of University of Padua, where many of the guests at the biblical banquet studied and sojourned for a while, has published two of our main papers devoted to Ortiz, two of that are circulating. The first one to his life, and the second one to his presence in the wedding of Cana, in addition to another still visible evidence in the canvas, an amount of 11 graphic and designo elements related to our model. As we have already pointed out, it's certain that Ortiz was in Naples at least since 1553, given that the dedication of the treatise is signed there. The papal sanction identified him as chapel master of the viceregal court of the city, SIC. This happened 2 years before the old chapel of Pedro de Toledo was refounded again by Pedro Pacheco in 1555. He is Pedro Pacheco. Apart from the Casa de Alba document of 1558, Ortiz's trace is lost again until the publication of his second book, 7 years later in Venice in 1565. However, a recent happy discovery by one of us, Javier Alejano, places him in the same city also a couple of years earlier, in 1563, at San Giorgio Maggiore. The first detailed study dedicated to musical patronage in 16th century Rome, recently published by Valerio Morucci of the University of Nevada in Reno, has brought to light new documents from the Vatican Secret Archives, which show that Ortiz did not die in Naples in 1570, when he was succeeded as Maestro de Capilla at the Royal Chapel by the Aragonese Jiménez de Loscos. The evidence indicates that he apparently moved to Rome to serve the Colonna family as a familiare, perhaps with the consent of his master, Per Afán Enríquez de Rivera, the viceroy, who died 1 year after Diego left his position. His contract ended on June 12, 1570, but it is possible that he remained in Naples until Per Afán's death on April 2, 1571. The first documented payroll is from 1572. The patriarch of the Colonna family at this moment was Marco Antonio Colonna II, third Duke and first Prince of Paliano, Constable of Naples, Viceroy of Sicily, and Captain General of the Papal Navy. The documents establish several monthlies for 4 years, between 1572 and 1576. Then, his death must be reconsidered later to this date. It is possible that his new position at the Roman court was similar to that in Neapolitan court, or perhaps he served as instructor for members of the family environment, as we postulate for him in the Veronese painting, or even in a position more in line with their merits and age. The title familiare was given to those professionals who, in addition to their salary as contracted artists, were under the protection of the family as members of the house they represented. The entourage of familiari at a baronial court, like at other princely establishments, ranged from wards and secretaries to cooks and musicians. The Colonna, the fourth most important family in Naples, were one of the two most influential lineages in Rome for centuries, along with the Orsini, with documented ancestors prior to the year 1000, and were reputed to be direct descendants of the ancient Roman dynasty Julio-Claudia. Both Orsini and Colonna families established an interfamilial network for the circulation of musicians around their possessions in Naples, Rome, and Florence. The Colonnas were intensely involved with music activity from the beginning of the Cinquecento. However, only a few account books after 1550 have survived. Fabrizio Colonna, died in 1520, hosted in his palaces of Rome and Naples some of the most famous musicians of his time, among them Costanzo Festa. The Dávalos family, related to Colonnas, also sponsored an intense musical activity in their properties, especially at the Ischia court of Aragonese fortress in Naples, through e.g. Vittoria Colonna, personal friend of both the emperor and Michelangelo, Constanza de Ábalos to the right, and their relatives. There is only one image of Constanza de Ábalos. This is a fresco of the church in the Ischia island. Maria de Aragona, the second one, bride at the wedding, along with her sister Giovanna and Julia Gonzaga, knew very probably Diego Ortiz at the Neapolitan court. Vittoria Colonna's cousin and husband successor, Alfonso de Ábalos, the bridegroom in the Veronese canvas, the bridegroom of Maria de Aragona, not Eleonor de Francia, as the legend says. Alfonso de Ábalos was the author of the text for two well-known madrigals by several composers of the Cinquecento. Marco Colonna II, the last known patron of Diego Ortiz, was Captain General of the fleet in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and shortly after the death of the viola gambist who whispers in the ear of the Veronese. Shortly after the death, Philip II appointed him, Marcantonio Colonna, Viceroy of Sicily in 1577, where he reorganized the musical chapel of Palermo. The documentation reflects the purchase of several music editions for the chapel, masses, motets, and various sacred works composed by first-rate musicians active in Rome, among them Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, Pedro Guerrero, Mauro Ciaula, Mario Cangialosi, and Ortiz himself, who lived at his own Roman court as a familiare until 1576. The Colonna Palace was commissioned by Odone Colonna, Pope 206, Martin V, for his relatives, where they have resided without interruption to the present day. Ortiz probably lived here, in addition to interpreting his art for the family. A final example, also iconographic, of the influence of Diego Ortiz on the artistic and intellectual culture of his time is found in a canvas by the Italian painter Evaristo Bascenis, where one of the pages of his treatise is reproduced. It is also the only unequivocally identified score among the painter's numerous work. Evaristo is on the left, and this is the Ortiz's score, the only identified. We are showing our publication to the present days. The first one devoted to Diego Ortiz, which already announced Giorgione's presence in the canvas. The second one with our presentation at the 2019 Lucca International Conference, Luigi Boccherini Foundation. Third, an historical tale relating the avatars of the canvas in a literary style, and a brief review of the state of the art till that moment. The two central covers down show the conformation of second consort, Lutz, and how Paolo II Frankenstein was generated from other previous cartoons, and the first group of characters which we think have identified following Holt's legend Henry F. Holt, an English scribe, and our own observations, some coeval artists, patrons, and ecclesiastics. The other two, published by Musica et Figura, are devoted to Diego Ortiz. Third row shows our last and very recent edition devoted to the legends on the canvas and also those related to Giorgione, the reconstruction of the hidden trumpet behind Berenice, the arrangement of first consort, and finally the mutation to the two successive violin bands, the third and fourth consort. All publications, 4 of them bilingual, are directly available at our internet address, except the 2 papers which are the property of Musica et Figura. At our YouTube channel, Manuel Lafarga, you may visualize all our recorded conferences devoted to these topics, distributed in 2 lists of reproduction. One is Veronese's Ghosts, the other is Giorgione's True Ghost. However, there are more lessons really for the future, including the identity of near all the egregious coevals portrayed by Veronese at San Giorgio Maggiore. At present, there is one doctoral thesis in course by Penelope Sanz, my partner, at Polytechnic University of Valencia, devoted to the figure of Diego Ortiz and the Spanish-Italian networks of patronage and art collecting during the Cinquecento and Seicento. Today we are in Helsinki, and we hope to be in 2025 in England, with our next topic, a medieval precedent of trumpets shaped in you, physically non-existent to our works. In addition, we are pleased to introduce here a new research line emerged from the right side of Paolo Cagliari, one of the 3 only survival sources of the U-shaped trumpet around 1400, is coincident with the U-shaped trumpet behind the author of the canvas. During the next 4 plates, we will show our three reconstructions for these instruments. They were introduced at Castellón de la Plana in a brief cycle of 2 conferences by the authors and the responsibles of the reconstructions, Campos and Escribano. The first one, similar to that depicted on Veronice's back, appears in Charles the Noble's Book of Hours, and it is the property of Cleveland Museum of Art. The margin of this illuminated manuscript are profusely illustrated with grotesques, many of them paradoxical or meaningless, and others with references to popular or well-known characters of their time, including animals and chimeras, hybrids of animal-human, animal-animal, or animal-plant. Up to 104 of these figures are reading or doing something in relation to books, and more than 180 represent musical instruments, thus making it the Book of Hours that contains the most musical iconographic sources. Both trumpets in the Book of Hours are similar in design, unlike that of the Paduan Bible, whose bell is shorter than the main tube. Third trumpet appears at the Paduan Bible, the only illustrated Bible that survives from the Italian Gothic. The work has been divided in 2 fragments since the 16th century. One is in the Accademia dei Concordi in Rovigo, and another in the British Library, the one that concerns us here. Likewise, the 2 oldest direct representations of a luthier workshop for trumpets are that of Johann Christoph Weigel the Older in 1698, and the one that appears in the French Encyclopedia edited by Diderot and d'Alembert in 1765. However, we believe that the oldest one is that which appears on the same plate before the third source we are dealing with, the U-shaped trumpet of the Paduan Bible. This trumpet is a different specimen from those of Charles the Noble, since the length of the bell tube is clearly shorter than the main tube, less than half, inversely to the other 2 trumpets. This is the type of medieval U-shaped trumpet that seems to fit the instrumental prototype that the litus represented for the Etruscans and perhaps also for the Romans. 2 opus which allow to perform in these instruments, trumpets, have been commissioned for its premiere at Castellón de la Plana, Spain, on 2024. From left to the right, at the end of the presentation, Manuel Lafarga, myself, Luis Escribano de Luthier, Penélope Sanz, my colleague and partner, Jorge Camarero, the illustrator of some of the consorts, and Vicente Campos, the conductor of the institutions. Thank you very much for your attention. Doy paso a Penélope Sanz.
Thank you very much. Okay. The name of my presentation is Self-Publication and Self-Promotion in the Renaissance Musical Career. We use here the case of Diego Ortiz to illustrate some of the traits that we consider in quasi-universals in the career of a musician in this time. First of all, I want to talk about the concept of familiarity. As you know, Diego Ortiz was finally admitted as familiarity in the Colonna's court. As Maurici mentions, we can define the court as the space, in this case feudal nature, an entourage over which the aristocrat publicly exercise legislative, financial, administration, and his military power. In this context, all members of the entourage are considered familiarity, including musicians, wards, as Manuel mentioned before. This treatment supposes a bond of servitude with the aristocratic house in exchange for this protection, and therefore a relationship of reciprocity. The families Colonna and Orsini have strong lies between them and make possible a musical circuit between Naples, Rome, and Florence. The network they established included not only the exchange and promotion of musicians between the courts, under their influence, of course, but also the propagation of musical genres of both families' taste throughout the territories under their influence. As patrons, they controlled the development of genders such as the villanella and the madrigal, but especially the cultivation of monody in Rome. We come now to the Ortiz case. Okay, you know much of this data, of course. In 1553, appears publishing at Rome his Tractato de Glosas, dedicated to the Comendador Santiago, Señor de Ayerbe y Barón de Reisi, where Pope Julius III speaks about the musician as his beloved son, Diego Ortiz, cleric from Toledo. 5 years later, we find Ortiz as maestro de capilla at the viceregal court of Naples under Fernando Álvarez de Toledo, and 1 year later continues under in the same church, but now under the Viceroy Pere Afán de Rivera. We know that in 1573, his portrait appears in Veronese canvas, The Wedding at Cana. 2 years later, published at Venice, his first book of hymns dedicated to the Viceroy, per Afán de Rivera, in Naples, published in Venice. This Viceroy, that's important information for our argumentation. This Viceroy was 12 years Viceroy of Naples under the King Philip II of Spain. As Viceroy, he blocked the promulgation of the decrees of the Ecumenical Council of Trent and the Philip II introduction of the Spanish Inquisition in Naples. In 1570, something was happened when Francisco Martínez de Losco succeeded him as Maestro di Capella at the Viceregal Court. Next notice we have from Ortiz was between the 1572 to 1576 as familiare at the Colonna's court in Rome. Unfortunately, a good part of the Colonna's archive documents from this period are lost, which prevents us from establishing the exact moment of his arrival in Rome. The surviving Ortiz months payments begins at the April of 1572 until the September of 1576. Thanks to them, we know that he was considered familiare at the Colonna's court. I want to talk now about the attributes of the portrait in the Trattato. But first, I can to talk about some traits of the Trattato. This is the first printed ornamentation manual for the player of Everest instruments. Not only is a practical manual, a method of musician of performance, but also it contains characteristics that elevate it at the category of a theoretical treatise. Its self-promotional nature is peculiar in several aspects. First, it is published in 2 different editions, Italian and Spanish. Second, it has 2 different parts. The first one is headed by the bust and the portrait of the author. We can only imagine the enormous financial investment that made it possible. Both the name of the dedicate and the mention in the publication permission of Julius III point to possible sources of financing. We can talk about a double innovation. On one hand, technical, powerful for musicians and amateurs of all kinds, and in second hand, propaganda in the modern sense of the term. We go now with the portrait in the Trattato. As Privitera mentions, the bust of Ortiz appears without a hat, contrary to what was usual in the iconography of clerics, with a neat hairstyle in accordance with that of the Roman medals and coins, but also discarding the model of representing himself as virtuoso with his musical instrument, also common in musical editions till the day. He claims for himself a high-level intellectual status. In addition, it is also the first example of a realistic portrait in a book of his nature. In the portrait by Veronese, 10 years later, and only 2 years before his last publication in Venice, we find his image inserted in the Paolo's canvas at Venice, San Giorgio Maggiore. it is not only the obviously physical resemblance that gives us clues to the fame he enjoyed at the time, but it is also the position he occupies behind the author of the canvas in a consort of viola da gamba. We can see clearly that Veronese, in his interpretation, mixes Ortiz's interpretation of his own portrait with self-assuring portrait with the classical images of musicians as virtuoso with musical instruments. The fact that the publication of the Trattato was bilingual was already something extraordinary in a manual that, in addition to being practical, claimed to the dignity of the theorist and their intellectual attributes. It is possible that Diego Ortiz expanded with this exceptional edition the possible sponsorships for that he aspired to. On the one hand, he was one of the first to address directly to an emerging market, and evidently his intended target audience included both Spanish and Italian-speaking territories. Did this also draw the attention of potential patrons of both languages? The popularity of the viola da gamba, not only among professional musicians but also among amateurs, guaranteed it to reach a large number of clients. Let us remember the Bostini tradition, according to which Venetian painters claimed themselves as amateur musicians. Illustrated in Veronese, the wedding at Cana, through the use of a gold ring, they will characterize the painter musicians. It is therefore not surprising that the Trattato was widely disseminated and witnessed even the appearance of some time later of one of the recercadas on the canvas of Evaristo Barsenis. At this point of the argument, the fact that Ortiz was represented by Veronese in his famous canvas, either because he knew him personally, is a Giorgio Majori, or because he was familiar with the Trattato, is immaterial. What is clear is that the Ortiz propaganda campaign to self-assuring since 1553 brought him the fame and was able to conclude, already in his majority, with the merit of reaching the Colonna's court at least since 1572. Thanks for your kindness and for your patience.
If you have any questions, I have one card for you, in any case. Thanks for your presence.
So thank you for those three contributions to a subject that is it's clearly important at all kinds of levels of understanding music history. Obviously, in the specific case of understanding Spanish-Italian musical relations in the middle of the 16th century, but also more broadly in terms of questions of musicians self-fashioning, right? And I was particularly struck by the commentary around the engraving at the beginning of the Trattato de Glossadas, where he presents himself as this intellectual figure and not as a practicing musician. And my question is this: I mean, what do we know about if these are self-published works? They may be self-published, but there are engravers in play, right? The engraving has to be undertaken by individuals. The engraving of the music and the engraving of the portrait of Ortiz. My question is, what do we know about those individuals? Do we know anything about who actually engraved the music, who actually engraved the portrait?
Yo no he entendido la pregunta.
Le pregunta por el grabado, por los autores del grabado.
The engraver is anonymous.
¿El cómo?
El grabador es anónimo.
¿El grabador de dónde? ¿Del tratado?
Del tratado.
No, el grabador.
So we know nothing then, in other words.
No,
we
no,
don't
no,
know
no.
anything about the engraving.
The next portrait engraved is from 5065, and its name is known, but this is unknown.
So for the 1565 Liber Primus of the Hymni, we know who the engraver of the music is. Is there a portrait in the 1565 print as well?
En el Musical Liber Primus
No.
hay.
No,
There is no
I see.
a portrait of Ortiz.
Yes.
The 1953 is not engraved, it's printed. The music.
Use the
Oh,
microphone.
sorry. The 1553 Tratado de Glosas is not engraved, it's printed. The music. The engraving is of the portrait only.
So what technology is used for
It's printed staves and as it was done
Es un grabado, es otro tipo
in
de.
the 16th century.
Madera.
I don't understand that. Engraving is printing, right?
No. Engraving is handwriting in a plaque. That is at the early 17th century,
Which is then printed, right?
which is then printed. But this is the movable type printing that was used in the 16th century. It's a different type of thing. Valerio Dorico, they were doing.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear. Sorry, let me have the microphone.
Yeah.
Sorry, my question was, do we know who actually undertook the engraving of the portrait? And the answer is no. My other question is, do we know who was responsible for the typesetting of the music? And that's a.
The brothers Dorico were the most important printers of music in Rome.
The editors, you say?
No,
The editors of the treatise, the Dorico brothers,
So
the papal editors.
Right. And so they were responsible for the typesetting, or for the publication.
Both.
So how is this self-publication then? If it's actually
That is a very good question.
I mean, if it's published by Dorico,
Yeah.
I can't quite see how this is
In
self-publication.
one of the slides
Okay.
that they presented at the end, there is a suggestion as to Julius III as being a
Yeah.
patron of the actual publication. As far as I understand, that is
Perhaps I think I understand what you are trying to ask. The two versions, the Italian and Spanish for the treatise, it is supposed that was the work of Ortiz himself. The reason that the treatise was published in Italian and also in Spanish is supposed that is because Ortiz himself was the responsible.
Okay.
But the editors are the Dorico brothers.
Right. That's not what I would call self-publication.
I agree with you.
No, not self-publication. Self-promotion we are speaking about, not self-publication.
Huh.
Penelope did not speak
Okay.
about self-publication.
Okay. Any other questions?
So many things there that it would take a long time.
We have 3 minutes. If anyone has any pressing questions. I was.
In our webpage, you have many more than 3 hours and time, and you can you can check all that you.
It's una curiosidad. That's just a curiosity. How did you arrive into the collaboration? How did you? A ver, lo digo en español que va a ser más fácil. Sí, ¿cómo llegasteis a montar el equipo, ¿no? que trabajó en toda la parte de la reconstrucción y el análisis iconográfico de la pintura? He visto ahí a Natividad, a Nati,
Sí.
que es también profesora en la
Nati
Bellas
solo
Artes.
participó en la primera
Ya
publicación.
me imagino, ¿no? Pues es interesante, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista... I'm sorry, Mark.
No, no,
Yeah,
No,
I was
translate,
saying it's
translate.
just a curiosity because I know some of the colleagues that work at the Bellas Artes faculty and that were part of the team that made all the analysis, iconographical analysis. So my question, I assume that that's a very precarious or not institutional collaboration. How did it happen that you began to work together? And because that's a huge project, no? Isn't it? Yeah.
We began 8 years ago with Natividad and Teresa Chàfer.
They
And
both
Javier.
come from Bellas Artes.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
They are sculptor teachers, professors. Javier Alejano, the discoverer, who identified at first time the Ortiz, after 10 years claiming and speaking to specialists, and also participated in the two publications by Musica et Figura. Later, we found one painter, one of my students, composer at this time, and painter, digital painter, and Penélope and I, ¿quién me olvido? Well, the reconstruct the Castellón de la Plana luthier and Vicente Campos, and the methodology from 8 years ago, this is literal for Penélope and me, was that of medieval monks. Nulle dies sine linea. That's the way.
Thank you. Well, I think if there are no more questions, or at least if there are questions that are going to last for hours, I think we should probably stop, and we should thank Manuel, we should thank Penelope, and we should also thank Teresa in absentia for this this extraordinarily rich session, rich in terms of archives, organology, and history, and it just throws into relief again, doesn't it, the importance of our colleague Diego Ortiz. So thank you very much indeed. Excellent work. Thank you.
Thanks to you.